Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We will continue to let people in from the waiting room, but I'll start the introduction as people join our meeting tonight. My name is Maya Stark, and I'm one of the exhibitions coordinators for the Saskatchewan Craft Council. My coworker Leah Moxley-Tygrob is also here and will be helping you out in the chat if anyone runs into technical issues this evening. I have the great pleasure of hosting tonight's Talking Craft Artist Talk with Cathryn Miller. Cathryn will be talking about their new exhibition, Square Dance, which is currently on view at the Saskatchewan Craft Council Gallery until March 6, 2021. I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, Creative Saskatchewan and the City of Saskatoon. Their generous support makes tonight's programming, such as tonight's Artist Talk, possible, so thank you. Okay, so acknowledging the space that we are occupying is unique on a digital platform. In consideration of that, I want to recognize that the headquarters of Zoom technology occupy the traditional lands of the Ohlone and Tamiami peoples, on which is what is now called San Jose, California. The land on which I am on, and on which the Saskatchewan Craft Council Gallery resides, where we usually meet, is on Treaty 6 territory. This is the traditional territory of numerous First Nations peoples, including Plains and Woods Cree, Dene, Nakota, Saulteaux, and Anishinaabe, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. I would encourage everyone visiting us today to go to www.whos.land and become familiar with traditional and treaty territories in North America, as well as the rest of the world. Speaking of where we are, I'd like to ask quick if everyone who wants to could put into the chat where they are from. It would be really interesting and wonderful to know where you are joining us from tonight. And for those unfamiliar with Zoom, it gives you an opportunity to try out the chat. So the chat window is at the bottom of your screen. You just tap it and a little window comes up to your right, and then you can drop your cursor in the bottom and type and press enter when you send us your message. Perfect, people already have that completely figured out. Thank you. So before I turn things over to Cathryn properly, I do want to take care of some more light housekeeping. For anyone new to Zoom or this type of online event, I just want to let you know about a few things. You would have seen a pop-up disclaimer. We are recording this artist talk with the goal of posting it on YouTube with captions at a later date. Your microphone would have automatically been muted when you arrived. So please check and make sure you are still muted. This limits any noise interference. Your video was also automatically turned off, but we encourage you to turn your cameras on if you are comfortable. This makes a more welcoming experience for the speakers if we can see your lovely faces. Okay, Cathryn is happy to take questions after their presentation. If you have a question, please type it into the chat window, and SCC staff will make sure that we see it and ask it on your behalf after the presentation. You can ask a question at any time, but we will address all questions at the end. Okay, I think that's it. So I'm honored to present award-winning paper and textile artist, Cathryn Miller. Thank you, Cathryn, for joining us tonight.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here. And I'm about to, with the miracles of technology, start a slideshow, I think. Okay. Is that coming through? Are you getting the full screen?
Yep, it looks perfect to me.
Good. I called the show Square Dance because the main design element in the exhibition is the square, and dance indicates celebration and gathering and positive things like that. And I liked the combination. It did result in a couple of confusing things on Instagram, but there it is. This is a square. It sits quite happily on one side when left alone. You can sit it on its tip and it looks more energetic. You can put it on a slight angle and it gets a little anxious. You can divide it in triangles. You can divide it in more squares. You can use multiple squares to build a grid. If you're interested in expanding it into other shapes, you can build a series of squares using the Fibonacci series, which means that each the one side total of the previous two becomes the next square. And you can make a Fibonacci spiral out of that, which is really close to the golden spiral, but not quite. You can find squares in nature. They're not really common, but minerals provide a couple of examples. If you do origami, you can make almost anything out of a square, from a small bird to, if your paper's big enough, a life-size elephant. The square has long been used in the building of sacred architecture. So from the pyramids at Nuri, Chichen Itza, Japanese sacred temples, mosques in North Africa, churches in England. In the visual arts, the square makes its first prominent appearance in Leonardo da Vinci's drawing of his idealized Vitruvian man. To make it clear, the square is the man's height and the man's span are equal. It starts to appear in visual art more in the 20th century. So this painting is from the early 20th century, as is this one, but it really hits its stride in the mid 20th century. Third quarter of the 20th century, really, starting in the 50s. It's been used in explaining color theory. It's been used to explain composition. It's a great teaching tool. It's also ubiquitous now on the internet. It's on computer technology. So it appears in our lives on multiple occasions. As well as being interested in the square as a visual form, I'm interested in memory. And being interested in memory means I'm also interested in things like codes and encryptions, information storage and retrieval. Maps are a form of code. I particularly like this one, which is literally carved in stone, grid and all. Language is a form of code. From pictographs to ideograms to alphabets. Humans have created codes to permit the easier transmission of information, or the better storage of information, or the hiding of information. This is from the German Enigma machine. Sometimes letter forms aren't really anything. This is known as asemic writing. This is a piece I particularly like. It's a work by Xu Bing, and it's called Book from the Sky. He created over a 4-year period 4,000 Chinese characters, or rather characters that look like Chinese but aren't, and printed a set of 4 books. This is printed in various iterations for an installation. And sometimes artists create their own letter forms that are their own language. I have a history in textiles, and the square and code both enter into textiles because the information transmission of patterns is often done in a grid in a form of code specific to that textile process. I used 3 tools primarily in creating the work in the show. I used a snap-off blade knife, an awl, and a bone folder. The first piece I want to talk about is In Winter. It's the oldest piece in the show. It was created in 2015. It took 2.5 months to make. The design was created by juxtaposing and overlaying a large square grid with diagonals and horizontals and verticals over a ordnance survey map pattern. This is of a specific place in England, and a smaller grid pattern with outlined letters. The pieces were all hand cut and stitched. There are 140 squares of cut paper in the piece. I was once asked if the work was like snowflakes, and I didn't understand the question, but it took me a moment. And then, yes, it is like snowflakes. No two squares in this piece are alike. We've stayed twice at the Thwaite Arms in Horsehouse, Coverdale in Yorkshire. On the second occasion, we had a conversation with the landlord's wife. She commented that many people found the high moors around the village dark and forbidding, especially in winter. She then described her own feelings, and her sentence stayed in my mind for a decade. I wrapped the hills around me like a shawl. I cannot remember anyone else in my life saying something so wonderful about where they live. This piece won the Premier's Prize in the Saskatchewan Craft Council Juried Dimensions exhibition that year. Moody Blues. This is the first of pieces constructed using an origami patchwork system. The system was designed by Tomoko Fuse. This is a locking panel. I had actually learned this structure as a book cover earlier. And here's squares being put together. The instructions for the origami patchwork don't actually work if you're working with heavier papers, so I had to create my own version. The interconnecting panels between the squares were designed with an extra space in the middle. This means that it allows for the bulk of the paper, and it also allows the piece to be folded. These were test samples. You can see that the locking panel in the center on the right is quite small. The orange paper is also a locking panel, and it can cover the whole piece. And there's a test sample done before starting construction on the piece I was working on. Here are the units for the piece. You can see the gap in the middle there. More pieces cut, so the background squares and some of the connecting panels. More connectors. Some of the connectors have patterns, some of them have words, some of them have music. And a few of the locking panels in the center most of them are blue, but a few have designs on them or images. I created a hanging system for the piece. 4 of the panels have a grommet in the back so that the piece can be hung. This is the finished piece. This was done to represent a decade in my life. Moody Blues is a time capsule for the years between 1961 and 1970. It has an imagined olfactory component, starting with the smell of gym socks and brown paper bag lunches and shoe polish and sunlight laundry soap, and ends smelling like patchouli and sandalwood and just a hint of something else. It starts with my last year of primary school and ends with my post-art school study of honors English in university. It sounds like playground skipping songs at the beginning and concludes with a soundtrack from the Beatles. ENNEAD number 1. ENNEAD is just a word for a group or set of 9. This is constructed in the same way, but the locking panels are significantly larger, and it's based on a 9-patch design for quilting. So there are 9 squares stitched on each panel. This is another specific set of memories. These are from a single year. The year is 1958, and the place is Notre-Dame-de-Grâce, Montreal, La Belle Provence. I'm in my 9th year. It is the year I discovered that rain clouds have edges and that the number 9 is magical. The colors were selected from that world: linoleum and hardwood floors, asphalt, family clothing, including my brownie uniform. If the paper quilt had an olfactory component, it would smell of paste wax and diesel bus fumes, and of mothballs and camphor for my grandmother, tigress perfume for my mother, and white owl pipe tobacco for my father. Warm weather would add the smells of lilac, followed by mock orange and hot tar. Winter sounds like urban traffic muffled by snow, and summer sounds like children playing outdoor games. G is for geography. This was a new structure that I invented and then discovered was used by a bookbinder in Holland, who calls it the Shrigley binding. Each of the panels had to be pierced to be sewn together. And I had to pierce 2 panels at once so the holes matched. You can see the panels in the back are stacked in rows. So they've already been sewn into strips, and then the strips were sewn together. And then all of the edges were glued down, leaving little pockets at the corners. So this could be a blank, this is a blank canvas. I could put anything on this. There's one of the junctions. So as I say, you can just insert any squares that you wanted into this. In this case, it's sections of map. This is one of 2 pieces that are based on, they have a pre-existence as books, actually. So they're based on books that I had already made. Decided to cover the junctions in the central area of the piece with covers. So there's the covers cut out. There's covers with stitching patterns. I created my own symbol to indicate both travel and wind, because wind is an element in the story in the book. I had scanned images of stamps and I simulated stamps. There they are lying on the piece before being attached. And there's the finished piece. One of the one of the squares covering the junctions has an X on it, because that's where the X is in the alphabet, because the piece is an alphabet. This is the book it was based on. Each of the pages on the book starts with a letter of the alphabet in sequence through the story. And you can see the images are square. I had to create a different hanging system for this one. The grommet right through the back would have made the map page stick out too far where it was sitting over the grommet. So I attached grommets by sewing them through to the back on a little extra piece. L is for lettering. This is the second one based on an alphabet book that I had done. The letters were individually stitched on the panels, and the stitching matches the background printed pattern. There's the finished piece. This one also comes with a book. Each book has a cutout letter inserted in the front fold-in of one of the hand-drawn letters I did for the book. The book simulates a homework exercise, so it's marked in red pencil after printing, as if it was being marked by one of my teachers at art school, including a comment that would have typically been made by that teacher in the very back page. The third piece using the Shrigley binding structure is not a book. Every day between the hours of 11:30 a.m. and 1:30 p.m. between July 15th and August 15th for 2 summers, I photographed the sky north of my house. So standing outside my house and looking north. I chose 5 of the images to use for the final piece. And so there's a time and there's a date stamp on 5 of the panels in the piece. So this is another form of recording memory. We're more and more humans are storing their memories externally. They like having a backup hard drive. I used the same travel wind symbol that I used on the G is for geography piece for this one. Some of the images were, the piece is a compilation of summer memories, ranging from lying on my back in long grass, finding pictures in clouds, to hearing Chuck and Joni Mitchell perform at the Fourth Dimension Coffee House in Winnipeg during the summer of 1966, to watching the clouds pass over my current home and leave no rain behind in the driest years. Despite the visual promise of moisture, the memory smells of heat and dust, and in the case of the Fourth Dimension Coffee House, a now almost unimaginable amount of cigarette smoke. 5 of the pieces in the show are made out of Menko, which is a folded structure, in this case made out of 2 strips of paper. This is the first one. I began by backing paper. Because 4 of the pieces are word-based, I used old dictionary pages and backed them with mulberry paper. They were then coated with a starch paste acrylic mix to color them. And you can see folded out of 2 strips. Each manko is basically two shades, either of the same color or 2 different colors. There's a bunch of the colors that I created. Bunches and bunches of manko. The March 14th piece was assembled by opening each manko and then closing it again over a single thread. That's the entire piece close up in a box. There's a section of it spread out. It's actually contains 1,063 manko and is 37 meters long. It's a single layer encryption in tribute to Chinese artist Chu Bing and his text-based installation that I showed earlier, Workbook from the Sky. And it's also a tribute to those individuals who have achieved some level of accomplishment in a particular challenge of memorization. It begins with a fancy folded thing called a cube star and looks very nice hung in the gallery. It creates wonderful shadows. The rest, there are 4 wall pieces made out of manko, and the 4 works contain quotations from texts I have read and remembered. The quotations are readable when you solve the 2-layer encryption. So the previous piece has a 1-layer encryption. These have 2-layer encryption. It's really, really simple substitution. So it should be possible to solve it. These ones smell faintly of moldering paperback books. So here's one of the pieces laid out. The manko were attached in this case by running a thread horizontally. So it went through the top of one square and the bottom of the next. And there's the conundrum of the workshops on the work table and then in the gallery. Girl in the Golden Atom. This one was composed of diagonal pieces, so I had to have a different assembly structure. This is a diagram showing the threads going through. They go through the lower edge and then the upper edge and then the lower edge of squares. So each manko had to be opened 4 times to assemble the piece and put the threads inside. There it is. I move things around a lot, so I would spend a lot of time staring at a work table that looked like this, and then I would move 2 things. And I had to keep the code intact, so that was also tricky. David helped me proofread things before I did the final assembly. Ship of Fools. When I was trying to design these pieces, I attempted to create a visual impression of the book or the quotation through color and shape. So there are shapes built in. This is another work in progress shot. And on the wall. These are better from a distance. And this is the final manko piece, Mademoiselle de Maupassant. De Maupin. It's a very short quotation in this one, and I chose the pink because of the lead character in the book. There are 2 more manko pieces. These ones are made to record family history. They're inspired by textile traditions passed down in my family. My maternal grandmother and my mother were skilled seamstresses. My grandmother also introduced me to other needlework skills, embroidery, knitting, and crochet. It is unfortunate I was too young and she was too old when she tried to teach me to tat. It was a very frustrating experience for both of us, as well as memories. The second piece in this group actually contains physical items. I started by making rust prints for the first piece. This involved soaking paper in acidulated water, that's basically water with vinegar dumped into it, and keeping it wet for about a week and a half to get it to rust enough to make a print. And then the prints were, because rust is very hard on paper, I then scanned the prints and printed them and then folded the squares. This piece is a combination of the Shrigley square and Menko. There's some Menko locking panels. I also backed sewing pattern paper with mulberry paper to make it strong enough to work in the piece. And I used a lot of handmade paper as representative of the hand processes that I had been taught. There's a Menko sewn into the center of every square panel, and the panels are connected by strips of 3 Menko, and these were mounted on a cardstock strip. And then the strips were sewn to the squares. That's how it looks from the back. You can see all the sewing. And from the front. The second piece was much simpler to assemble. There's strips were made just assembling strips of Menko on cardstock, and then the strips were sewn together. This is the picture piece from the back, which is remarkably tidy. That second line of squares inside, the Menkos in those ones actually contain sewing notions that were passed down from to me from my mother, who had inherited them from our grandmother. So there's tiny, tiny buttons and hooks and eyes and snap fasteners in that row of Menko. 2020 hindsight. 2020 hindsight is actually a set of an edition of fortune tellers, 9 of them. I think fortune telling really requires memory. Humans have tried to predict the future for as long as history's been recorded, and presumably before that. Prognostication in any form requires memory of the past, both in the asking of a question and in the assessment of the answer. So I have had an ongoing fascination with fortune tellers, and I've used them in a number of pieces. This piece, which is called Finding a Way, actually has 15 different historic methods of fortune telling. And last year I took a month off from working on the square dance exhibition, and I built this thing, which just got totally out of hand. It still uses the square as a basic design element, but it's got round things in it. There's an actual working iris at the front. There's an extending system so that you can choose whether you're an optimist or a pessimist. It's fairly simple to operate. The volvelle at the back gives you 4 choices. And when you look through, that's what it looks like. The construction of 2020 hindsight started with sealing 4 hardwood blocks, which took an unconscionable amount of time. I had to seal them so that I could glue paper to them. These are the papers I chose. Here are the blocks waiting for their last trim after gluing. And here are the blocks completed. I then had to add panels so that you could get a different fortune depending on which side came up. I chose 7 colors, and by rotating them, even though there are 3 of each basic paper cover, there are no 2 versions of the piece exactly alike. I designed 6 symbols, 1 for each side of the cube. They can be interpreted in whatever way the user wants. There they are, ready to be glued on. And there's one of the finished pieces. I also made boxes because you need to rotate the piece in your hand while you're thinking of a question. To reduce wear, I created a box for the pieces. It also means you can't peek while you're doing it. Memory bank. The odd thing about this series was that I actually came up with this idea and had the plans for it before COVID. So it just goes to show you can't tell. Memory bank. Each individual memory bank is representative of a specific walking holiday in Britain. Hidden inside each one is a smaller cube commemorating a specific town or village. Like actual memory, events come out of order and memories become conflated over time. If the works were truly representative of our walking holidays, they'd be wet. I backed map paper from an atlas, a road atlas of Britain. There's a test locking panel, and I designed paper weaving patterns. This is a cutting pattern for one of them. There's a strip being woven. And there's a final locking panel with its paper weaving. So there are 4 different designs on each cube. And there's the set of cubes, all the memory banks. The elements. This is the most book-like, since I'm normally a book artist. This is the most book-like set in the show. I designed 4 accordion books with 1 for each element. The images are all of personal significance. They're places I have been. The bottom image is my wood stove, which I've been using a lot recently. The images were divided in 4 and then panels were printed. You can see the fold in for the corners is just printed in a solid color. Again, I designed symbols specific to each element. It took me a long time to be happy with fire. There's the final cutting patterns. And there's one of the piercing templates. And there's a finished locking panel. These ones have a secondary piece of paper inside them, colored so that it masks the joints inside and it makes the cutting pattern show more. There's the insides of all 4 and the outsides. This is the final piece in the show. Pelmanism was a system of memory training developed in the 1920s in London by the Pelman Institute for the Scientific Development of Mind, Memory, and Personality. You may have encountered a version of it in Kim's game. The term also refers to any game requiring a player to memorize cards or other objects. So I've created a version of a find 2, match 2 game. I had to sand the edges on 48 pieces of bookboard, which was another really singularly tedious job. There's prepared bookboard and paper cut, ready to wrap. So there's 3 layers in each lid of on the work. The middle layer is larger so that the lids don't fall into the compartments, and then the smaller layers on top and bottom are thicker to prevent the lid from moving too much side to side. So you can see the 8 matching pairs. So you can play the match 2 game. You can do a simpler version. If you flip the Manco over, they're solid color on the back. So there's just eight colored pairs if you do it that way. Or if you don't want to use your memory at all, you can just play with the patterns on the top. And that's it. Ready for questions.
Thank you so much, Cathryn.
You're welcome.
Yeah, we will open this up to questions. So if you have a question, just feel free to pop it right into the chat. I just want to comment that it's so wonderful to hear more information about the pieces, because I'm becoming quite familiar with them. But that extra context to help us understand the artist's intention, it's so important. And yet you're still keeping things away from us with the codes.
Yeah,
that
you have to. I'm not giving away the code. No.
Yeah, you're not giving us everything, which is fine. I think that's really great. Actually, there's still mysteries for us to discover. I like it.
Well, some people will have figured out what the March 14th was instantly.
Oh yeah. Okay.
It will be recognizable.
Any questions from our audience? What was the time investment in creating this exhibition?
Oh, not including in winter, which I did well in advance, and uh, not including Moody Blues, which was also done in advance of the exhibition. It was about 2 years.
Wow.
Not quite full time. I had a life.
Good, good.
Though COVID, I must admit, made concentrating a lot easier.
I think a lot of artisans, craftspeople, and artists are finding that this year.
Well, I was actually lucky because I had a show to work on, so I wouldn't have been going out much anyway.
Yeah. Just a lovely comment from Rita St. Amant. That was just fabulous and so informative. Oh, here's a question from Barbara. How do you deal with the tedium required by many of these pieces?
Oh, so the tedium is, I try to break up jobs so that I'm alternating between things. I also play math games in my head. So for instance, I made a note so I could say it. There are the little sewn panels on the 2020 hindsight, the 9 versions. There are 3,780 stitches in the panels. So I do things like play math games in my head. How many, okay, there are 48 pieces of book board. They have 8 edges each. I have to sand all of the 8 edges, and then there are 4 corners each that I have to sand. So I do math games in my head, arithmetic games in my head. I sometimes listen to music, but the big one is just alternating between jobs. So I'll fold paper for a while, and then I'll cut paper for a while, and then I'll assemble something else. And I do a lot of morose staring when I'm assembling pieces, like the Menko pieces, where I'm doing a design with pieces of bits of color. I just stand and stare at things, as an alternative to doing something else.
Right. Well, I think that staring process I think that's something a lot of artists do, and it is really important.
Staring morosely is the key design process for almost everybody. Staring morosely, yes.
All right. Oh, we've got a bunch more questions. What inspired you to start this?
What inspired me to start? I'm not sure this. I'm not sure what this is. Can they be more specific?
I'm guessing it's of the Square Dance series, like the work for this project. Yeah.
I wanted to do something big. I work small most of the time. My book works tend to be, they're not the spectacular letterpress volumes that are elephant quartos and folios. They're little tiny books that people can hold in their hands, and I wanted to do something big. I wanted to do something that was more about color and pattern. I wanted to do, and I was really interested in dealing with the idea of memory, and finding different ways of representing memory, both pictorially and in encryption.
Okay. What are the qualities of paper that you love?
All the qualities of paper. The paper comes in a large range of qualities. So for instance, the Menko that's up on the screen right now, if people are still seeing that, is made out of 2 very different papers. The dictionary page is from an 1898 dictionary. So it's old paper. It's made probably from recycled clothing. It's quite sturdy and durable. It's been around for more than 100 years. The pink paper is something produced last year in Italy. It's done in environmentally sound ways, but it's a completely different field. It's got a slightly metallic finish on it. It's very shiny. It's very slippery. It folds much more easily than the dictionary paper. The dictionary paper tends to crush because it's slightly thick and loose. The pink paper has been really, really highly hot pressed, to give it that really super smooth finish, and to compact it so that it's very dense. I like all kinds of things about paper. I like Japanese papers for their transparency and their strength. I like copy paper because you can fold really crisp, sharp edges with it. So there are everything about paper, including the fact that I can make it myself.
I feel like I just learned that I could listen to you talk about paper for hours. So thank you. Okay, another question. Are there changes as you create a piece, or do you have a more linear process?
There are rarely changes in the concept of a piece. So I have the concept pretty firmly fixed, what the idea is. And sometimes things will change more than others. So the Pelmanism piece didn't change at all from start to finish. I knew what it was going to be from start to finish. The 2020 hindsight, the fortune tellers didn't change. They were completely predictable from start to finish. The Menko pieces probably changed the most because I was playing with both code and color. So I had to make compromises as things were put together. I would do an overall design with the color to get what I wanted as a sort of feel for the piece. Then I had to impose the code, which meant that I had to move things. I had to swap things out for color to make the code work. And I had to rotate things. So sometimes I would be moving pieces in and out of the piece. So they were more spontaneous in that I was working to try and fit a certain parameter of the code and still make the design work. So I didn't know what those ones were going to look like until they were done.
I have a question. For some of the pieces, like I'm thinking Moody Blues and ENNEAD #1, do you sketch before you begin, or is the process more?
I'm really lazy. No, I have a really good visual imagination. I can see things in my head and I know what they're going, and I've done most of these processes long enough that I know that something's going to work or not work. The only thing that I did that might be considered sketching was with ENNEAD. I played with laying embroidery thread across paper.
Gotcha.
But I am incredibly lazy. I do not do all of that production stuff of detailed working sketches ahead of time, and I know what it's going to look like.
I feel
pretty
like
much.
I think no one in this virtual room could ever claim that you are lazy.
Well, there's lazy and then there's lazy. I'm lazy about certain things. My mother thought I was terribly lazy because I would try and find the easiest way to do something.
You're efficient.
Well, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
I'm also very patient.
Yeah. Do you experience numerous paper cuts?
Actually, surprisingly few, given how many pieces of paper I handle that have just been freshly cut. I do get paper cuts and they are nasty.
Marlene asks, do you work in other art forms as well? Really enjoyed this. The finished works are so interesting.
Not as much as I used to. I still draw occasionally. I tend to do a lot more things. I do graphic design, but I tend to do it digitally now because it's easier to change your mind. I design books and I illustrate books, and I'm planning, actually, now that this is all done, to get back to playing with colored pencils for a while. So that's the next project.
Great. I'm looking forward to seeing that. Wow, we have, I think, quite a few more questions. Still up for some more, Cathryn?
Sure.
Okay, great.
David's making supper, so I don't have to worry about that.
That's great. Do you ever use mirrors or take a photo to see it backwards, as some artists do?
I take photographs so that I can, in the case of the Menko pieces, the only way I could see them when they were spread out on the work table, I couldn't actually see them. I had to stand on a stool and hold my camera over my head and, and photograph them. And then I could look at the photograph to see how they looked. I couldn't really, because I was looking at them horizontally, I couldn't actually see what they were like. So yes, I do use photographs to see what my work looks like.
All right. You mentioned starch and acrylic as a finish. Is this potato starch?
No, it's cooked wheat starch paste, and it's a traditional method of decorating paper. Acrylic paint wouldn't have been used originally, but starch paste decorated papers are quite old. It's most of the works in this show are done using bookbinding techniques. So so that's a bookbinding decoration. So end papers and paper covers used to be done with that technique. And it's cooked wheat starch paste.
Okay. Belinda asks, can you speak to the differences between working with paper versus using fiber? And this is a multi-part question. What led you to move away from fiber to paper? And do you still work in fiber?
Okay. First of all, she means textile processes. I consider paper a textile. And I probably would still be a weaver if I hadn't developed rheumatoid arthritis, which just made it impossible, even with good medications, made it impossible to weave. But I consider the paper to be related. It behaves in many ways like fabric. It does some things that fabric doesn't do. So I still consider myself in many ways a textile artist.
After an exhibit, what do you do with your pieces? Are they for sale? They are for sale, and we will link to the gallery page at the end of the talk. But Cathryn, what do you do with your works, the ones that return to you?
The works that get returned to me, I try to sell them. I also, in some occasions, I exhibit them in other venues. There's the possibility of another show for what works haven't sold from this show. There's a possibility of another exhibition already. And unfortunately, many of them will get stored. From the last solo exhibition I had, it was mostly installation works. So those pieces are not really saleable. And in fact, one of them was destroyed in the process of removing it from the gallery. Quite consciously, I knew it was going to happen, and I burnt that one. So I have lovely pictures of a huge bonfire with all these paper flowers going up in smoke. But mostly I try to sell them. It's how artists make a living.
Okay, I think that is our last question. Any other questions from our audience? Great questions, thank you. Lots of lovely comments. We'll share these with you later, Cathryn.
Okay.
Well, then I suppose we will start to sort of wrap up. Leah's popping some links into the chat for our virtual guest book, where you will also see some more links that Cathryn has supplied us with. Thank you again for sharing your practice with us, Cathryn. This was a very interesting talk. I feel like I've learned so much more about the exhibit, so thank you. Okay, so we're going to wrap up. In normal times, we would usually end a presentation with a lot of applause, which we can't necessarily do as easily tonight, but
I'll just imagine it.
Yeah, well, and I think it would be lovely if right before I end our meeting, you could unmute yourself and say goodnight or say thank you to Cathryn or some gentle applause. I think that would be really lovely. So thank you again, Cathryn.
You're welcome.
And
thank you, Cathryn.
good night, everyone.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Cathryn. That was amazing.
Thank you.
Wonderful to see you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
That
you.
was amazing.